Yes.
So we continue from August 1983 with the document that we were discussing last night. It comes from a congressional hearing that took place on the 1st and 2nd of August before a subcommittee of the House of Representatives Committee on Government Operations. The hearing was about the AIDS epidemic as a whole and focused on the federal government's response to it. The document to which I would like to take you is a written statement that was submitted to the hearing by Dr. Edward Brandt, who is the Assistant Secretary for Health at the Department of Health and Human Services. Shumik, it's JREE 606, and it's electronic page 306. In his statement, Dr. Brandt said this. 1. How is AIDS transmitted? Based on the best available information, we believe AIDS is transmitted sexually, particularly among homosexual partners, less frequently through transfusion of blood or blood products, or by the misuse of needles. We have no evidence that the disease is spread through air, food, water, or casual contact. To the contrary, AIDS is a difficult disease to contract. 2. What is the risk of acquiring AIDS through a blood transfusion? At present, the risk of acquiring AIDS through blood transfusion appears to be extremely small. Although as many as 10 million Americans received transfusion during the 3 years of the AIDS epidemic, CDC is investigating approximately 24 AIDS cases in which transfusions may be a risk factor. We believe that the PHS recommendations issued in March 1983, which suggested that members of groups at increased risk not to donate blood, will decrease the current risk. Those are the Public Health Service recommendations that were subsequently replaced by the FDA recommendations. 3. What is the cause of AIDS? Although we do not yet know the cause of AIDS, the evidence is strong that we are dealing with an infectious agent with a long incubation period. Public Health Service laboratory scientists are using the most sophisticated methods available in the search for this putative agent. The most plausible agents are viruses. The absence of illness in animals already inoculated with specimens may be a reflection of the long incubation period, or may indicate that the AIDS agent affects only humans. Unfortunately, it is not possible to predict when the cause of AIDS will be found. Then if we could go forward in the statement, please, to electronic page 25. Oh, sorry, my mistake, 325. Sorry, Shumik, my error. And if we could highlight the paragraph beginning at its July 19th meeting. By this point in his statement, Dr. Brandt has moved on to discuss some of the debates that have been taking place within the American scientific community. At its July 19th meeting, FDA's Blood Products Advisory Committee discussed the safety of plasma derivatives. This is of concern because haemophiliac patients require treatment with a product, anti-haemophiliac factor, derived from plasma.
I think it ought to be anti-haemophilic factor.
Yeah,
After all, the factor is not supposed to be anti-haemophiliac, is it?
No, it's not supposed to be. It should be anti-haemophilic factor. Derived from plasma, which is pooled from thousands of donors. However, I would emphasize that the risk of transmitting AIDS to an individual haemophiliac from a special lot of AHF is very small, if it exists at all. The committee recommended that no regulatory requirements regarding the recall or destruction of lots of AHF which may contain plasma from an AIDS donor, be developed, but that any cases that are identified be examined individually. In reaching such a conclusion, a number of variables must be considered, such as the degree of specificity of the diagnosis, the time of onset of symptoms in relation to the time of donation, the potential effect upon the immediate supply of AHF and the long-term production of this essential plasma derivative. Let me emphasize that the health of the individual haemophiliac patient will be a continuing concern for the Public Health Service. I pause there to note that is the meeting that we were looking at yesterday, and the summary that is contained in Dr. Brandt's statement to Congress draws seemingly from Dr. Donohue's memorandum that we looked at yesterday. Going back to the statement, Dr. Brandt continues, additionally, through these collaborative efforts, progress in developing new procedures for increasing the safety of clotting factor concentrates have been accelerated. One such product is currently available, and others are at a late stage of development. This ongoing cooperative effort will continue to monitor the nation's blood supply in attempts to ensure maximum safety and at the same time maintain adequate supplies of blood and blood product. I take the reference to the new procedures to be references to heat treatment. There was, of course, much other testimony heard at the congressional hearing. I won't take you through it. The purpose of reading out Dr. Brandt's, parts of Dr. Brandt's statement is that it contains a summation of what the federal government's position was at the time. And as we mentioned yesterday, we know that the hearing was reported back to the DHSS in the UK.
Could you just go down to the bottom of the page that's in front of us at the moment, the last paragraph, the National Institute of Mental Health?
If I read out that paragraph, so the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, held a research planning workshop on August the 1st, 1983, to address the mental health aspects of AIDS. Research will be encouraged in several areas. 1, the effects of stress on the immune system. 2, the psychological effects of AIDS on high-risk groups. 3, how to meet the psychological and emotional needs of AIDS patients. 4, anxiety in healthcare workers. And 5, the role of community and family in providing emotional support. A workshop to address the emotional concerns and support needs of AIDS patients, relatives, and healthcare providers will be held on August 3rd, 1983.
Well, I appreciate this is dealing with AIDS victims generally, not specifically those who had contracted the AIDS through taking a blood product. But it looks as though, in America at any rate, there was almost immediately concern for the mental health, psychological consequences of infection.
Yes, sir. A document that I didn't take you to yesterday, but is referred to in the written statement, comes from the Alpha pack of documents that was sent out in December of 1982. We looked at the document which was given to the donor in order to educate the donor, and then the donor was asked whether or not they were in any of the high-risk groups. There was a further document that was provided in December 1982 to any deferred donor, offering that donor a short piece of advice about the steps that that donor may wish to take in light of the fact that they had been deferred because of the ongoing element of the ongoing risk of AIDS. That is another example, perhaps, of how such considerations were in the minds of at least some of those involved in this area in the United States at an early stage.
To what extent was there anything comparable in this country? I don't think the inquiry's heard, has it, of any similar concentrated effort to address psychological consequences this early?
I certainly can't bring one to mind.
Well, if there is anything which comes to mind, let me know about it in due course.
We will look into that, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Shumik. We can take that down now. Moving to the autumn of 1983, according to Dr. Evett in his tragic history, by the end of August 1983, 26 patients with haemophilia and 26 patients who had received transfusions had been diagnosed with AIDS in the United States. You would have seen the reference to a couple of dozen of transfusion patients in the evidence of Dr. Brand. The following month, so September 1983, Dr. Luc Montagnier attended a conference in New York where he presented his team's findings that suggested that the virus he had isolated, LAV, was responsible for AIDS. This began a period of cooperation between Dr. Montagnier and the CDC, which led to the CDC developing assays that would be used in testing viral inactivation, particularly in heat-treated products. I just flag that now for the discussion that we will have later about those products.
I mean, he had already reported his results in May, had he not?
Yes, he had.
So that hadn't been picked up until now, it seems.
I wouldn't like to say that it hadn't been picked up. I'm not sure the extent to which the CDC had been aware of those findings, but it seems to have been from September that there is personal contact between Dr. Montagnier and the CDC, which leads to the development of their cooperative work together.
Yeah.
In the same month, September 1983, Highlands and the American Red Cross withdrew some fractionated blood products because of a perceived AIDS risk. Qatar did the same in November 1983. So these were the second and third product withdrawals from US companies. We have an internal memorandum from ARMA commenting on the Qatar withdrawal. And if we can have that on screen, please. It's ARMO 40302. The memorandum is dated the 7th of November 1983, and it's to Mr. Bishop, from whom we will be hearing tomorrow, so part of the UK subsidiary of ARMA. What the memorandum says is this: Qatar recalled 16 AHF lots, 6,400 vials, 2.2 MIO, I think that's 2.2 million international units, distributed to 33 countries, including Japan. Several other lots are on hold. One of Qatar's plasma donors recently died because of AIDS. The man donated about 5 litres of plasma over the time, but apparently failed to indicate any information about his disease during that time. We will probably have to expect very detailed questions regarding donor screening / selection of donors during the BGA hearing at, unfortunately this is obscured, and I'm not quite sure what that next word is.
It's not Berlin, is it?
It could well be Berlin, sir, yes. The BGA was the German regulator, so yes, Berlin fits. I am also concerned about suggestions that paid donors are less likely to be truthful when asked questions which would disqualify them as donors. Under the circumstances, I suggest that we have a meeting at 1 MP Sunday, I think that should be PM, Sunday the 13th, prior to the BPI meeting at 3 PM. at the Hotel Kempsky. The cutter incident is under investigation now, and Dr. Riddell will have detailed information available for our meeting. We regret the unfortunate circumstances of the cutter incident. However, the possibility of something like that happening to any plasma manufacturer cannot be excluded. It should be to our advantage to remind our customers in an appropriate form that Armour processes plasma from our wholly owned and fully controlled plasmapheresis centres. Plasma Alliance has a worldwide reputation for excellent quality and highest standards. Although it is obvious that it is actually not known how to avoid transmission of AIDS, it should be emphasised that we have recently introduced Factor VIII HT to improve the safety of our product. We will keep you informed on this matter and would appreciate any feedback. Regards, and it's from an Regier. Factor VIII HT is the heat-treated product. On the 22nd of October 1983, so after these products have been, or at least after the Highland and American Red Cross recall, but before the Cutter recall, on the 22nd of October 1983, the National Haemophilia Foundation issued a recommendation, in effect restating its formal position from the July 1983 meeting, namely automatic recall of products manufactured from plasma donated by a person who was later identified as having AIDS or characteristics strongly suggestive of AIDS. You will recall, sir, that proposition was put at the July meeting, but was somewhat undermined by Dr. Aladort immediately saying that he personally didn't agree with it. The NHF, however, restated it in October of 1983. It did not lead to any change in regulatory policy at that time. So that continued on a case-by-case basis. In the same month, this is October 1983, Highlands took a policy decision to cease using plasma from prisons in the manufacture of coagulation factors. We can look at a document which we've seen before, but I think is worth looking at again in the context of the wider debate of what should be done. It's CGRA 40291. It is from Dr. Srigley to D. Castaldi, dated the 20th of October 1983, so an internal Highland document. And it refers to a telecon with Dr. Donoghue of the FDA. What the document says is this: attached is the text which I used to define for Dr. Donoghue Travenol's policy with regard to the use of plasma from prison centres. He expressed his satisfaction with the policy and appreciation that we responded promptly to him. He asked that we not send it to him in writing at this time. But he says, if you have any additional questions, let him know. If we could turn over, please, to the next page. We can see this is the text that was used. It's marked as proposed text, but we know from the memorandum that it was used with Dr. Donoghue. What it says is this, and I quote, "We had previously made the decision to discontinue the purchase of plasma from licensed centres in prisons. To that end, we have chosen not to renew any pre-existing contracts with such centres after this year. Following my conversation with you yesterday, we have decided that we will promptly discontinue the use of such plasma for the manufacture of coagulation factors. We have pools in process this week which contain plasma drawn in prison centres. As of the end of this week, we will not make any coagulation factors from any of the prison plasma which remains in our possession, or which we are contractually bound to purchase through the remainder of the year. No further plasma pools used for coagulation factors will contain prison plasma. Any intermediate fractions manufactured from plasma pooled this week or in previous weeks would be processed to final product. And then there is an offer to put that policy in writing, which we know Dr. Donoghue did not take up. We discussed this document before, sir. It is clear from the statement that Highland Travenol had previously manufactured coagulation factors from plasma taken from prisoners, and that they were continuing to do so up until that very week. This is October 1983. The document doesn't specify whether or not that plasma was used in any particular set of products or whether it was sent to any particular markets. There's nothing in the document to say that it was treated any differently from the plasma that was used generally by the company.
Well, I think it does indicate, doesn't it, that the pools were used for coagulation factors?
Yes.
So
it was certainly used for the creation of factor products.
yes.
And there's nothing to say that those factor products were treated in any way differently to any other factor products that the company made.
Yes.
Just to break sequence slightly, on the 7th of January 1983, so 9 months before, 16 cases of AIDS in prison inmates had been reported in the MMWR. We could have on screen, please, JREE 5019, page 76. This is taken from the Institute of Medicine report, and they helpfully set out a table which shows the number of cases reported in different risk groups across the United States. And we can see 7th of January 1983, risk groups 16 prison inmates. And there is a snippet of the report which says, since male homosexuals and IV drug abusers are known to be at increased risk for AIDS, the occurrence of AIDS among imprisoned members of these groups might have been anticipated. So that comes from January 1983. Thank you, Shimit. We can take that down. I'm sorry, just at the bottom there. Moving on to December 1983, there is further discussion of the issue of surrogate testing. A joint meeting was convened on the 15th of December 1983 by the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute and the Office of Biologics. It took place to consider work that had been done by that time on surrogate testing. Different trials had been running in different parts of the country. In particular, it considered anti-hepatitis B core antigen testing, so the antibodies for hepatitis B core antigen. The Creever report summarised the meeting in a helpful way, which I will now take us to. It's KREV 601, electronic page 770, please. Yes, electronic page 770. And from the top of that page, this is what Mr. Justice Creever said about that meeting. In December 1983, the Food and Drug Administration's Blood Products Advisory Committee reviewed the research on various surrogate tests, including several pilot tests performed at blood banks in high-risk areas. 4 studies have been done on anti-core testing, 2 on beta-2 microglobulins, and single studies had been made of cytomegalovirus, EBV, which is Epstein-Barr virus, immune complexes, neopterin T-cell ratio measurement, thymosinal and alpha interferon. So these are all different surrogate tests that have been considered in various studies. Most of the discussion focused on the usefulness of anti-core testing. Dr. Joanna Pindyke, for example, summarized the results of anti-core testing done at the Greater New York Blood Programme. She reported that 5.5% of male donors under 35 years of age were core antibody positive, as were 7.7% of those over 35 years. The estimated cost of the test was $3, but the cost of discarding the units as well as recruiting efforts to replace the donor required further evaluation. Data from testing 8,049 donors at Irwin Memorial Blood Bank were also discussed. They demonstrated that donors living in an area of homosexually active men were likely to be positive for anti-HBC, and that the test could identify 89% of those most at risk of contracting AIDS. The committee members asked whether these data constituted, quotes, sufficient evidence to substantiate testing for anti-HBC, and expressed concern about the potential cost of such testing. We could go to the next paragraph, please. Although Dr. Donoghue, the director of the Food and Drug Administration's Division of Blood and Blood Products, had recommended to the committee that anti-core testing be implemented, Dr. Michael Riddell, a representative of ARMA, suggested that a task force be struck to consider the potential application of the anti-HBC test as an additional risk reduction measure and to report within 3 months. This suggestion met with universal approval from the committee members. Many representatives of blood products manufacturers had met the previous evening and agreed that the task force would, quotes, provide a delaying tactic for the implementation of further testing, which they expected would become a requirement later that year. We're going to look at a different source for the same meeting in a second, but before I do, I flag the point that Dr. Donoghue of the FDA had, at the start of 1983, expressed some reservations about hepatitis B core testing. From the summary that we see of that meeting, and indeed from other sources, we can see that by this stage, December 1983, Dr. Donoghue's position had changed and he was recommending that such testing be introduced. The reference to the meeting of the fractionators appears to be drawn from a note of a meeting prepared by Dr. Ajala of Qatar. We've seen many of his memorandums in the last day or so. The reference is UCSF 5034. The memorandum is dated the 19th of December. It's sent to a number of people within Qatar, and it is a report on the meeting that took place on the 15th and 16th of December, the meeting that we have just been discussing. If I could pick it up from the third paragraph, starting Donoghue recommended. This is Dr. Ajala's account of the meeting. Donoghue recommended that anti-core hepatitis B testing be incorporated for routine plasma screening in addition to current requirements, since it would identify 90% of all potentially infectious or high-risk donors. The anti-core testing would add a further measure of confidence in product safety at a relatively low cost for the products involved. He reviewed the AHF market withdrawals that had been conducted and indicated that core testing and heat treatment could eliminate this potential for the future. The advisory committee agreed with this recommendation, with the dissension of the acting chairman, Bill Miller, of the St. Louis Red Cross. Dr. Miller stated that he believed that any testing required for plasma should also be required for whole blood. The committee is aware of a scheduled January publication in the New England Journal by the CDC indicating AIDS transmission in more than 30 transfusions. Several members of the audience objected to the proposal for one reason or another, but Mike Riddell of Armour proposed a task force to deliberate the details of the recommendation and provide further information in 3 months. Go over to the next page, please. This proposal was one that had been agreed upon by all the fractionators the previous evening. The general thrust of the task force is to provide a delaying tactic for the implementation of further testing. It was generally agreed that core testing would eventually become a requirement. The addition of core testing is expected to eliminate approximately 15% of plasma donors and 6 to 7% of whole blood donors if used by blood banks. Some blood bankers mentioned that public pressures would certainly be a motivating factor for core testing at their facilities. The fractionators met with Donoghue following the meeting, and although Donoghue was not completely satisfied with the task force approach, he agreed to it. He stated that we should also take on the responsibility for all testing of recovered plasma. Riddell was named chairman of the task force, and a meeting will be scheduled in January. You could go on, please. John Hink, who, as we heard yesterday, is a fellow Qatar employee, in a prescient move, has already begun core testing at Qatar centres. We recommend that the implementation of core testing be accelerated to the maximum degree possible to obtain a competitive advantage in the marketplace. The approval of our heat treat submission, in conjunction with core screened plasma, could present us with a potent marketing advantage. We made no mention of our plans to the others. In summary, the conclusion of this meeting was that the time had come for hepatitis core antibody testing for plasma. Implementation will probably be achieved during 1984 for the industry. We will come back to Qatar's approach to hepatitis B core testing in due course. We have reached the end of 1983, and in summary, the year saw the introduction by all fractionators of enhanced donor screening processes. Following the publication of the FDA recommendations in March 1983, blood banks also introduced further steps, but they continued to be less robust than the ones that were put in place at the plasmapheresis centres. The 5 firms that supplied the United Kingdom gave undertakings to the DHSS that going forward, they would only supply products that have been manufactured from plasma after the introduction of their new enhanced screening processes. That commitment was prospective. Products that had already been produced were not affected and were not withdrawn, nor did the DHSS or the American authorities insist upon such products being recalled or withheld from distribution. One firm, Highlands, continued to fractionate from prison blood until October 1983. The wider issue of when products should be recalled had been discussed at length, but no consensus had emerged. The fractionators had argued that a policy of automatic recall would jeopardize supply and even the continuing existence of some firms. Their arguments were effective in that the FDA was not advised to and did not take formal regulatory steps in this period. Instead, recall was considered on a case-by-case basis. There were 3 such recalls in 1983. In July of 1983, the NHF had formally called for a policy of automatic recall, but as we have seen, was somewhat undermined by Dr. Aladort's personal views. His approach, as expressed at the meeting in July, was similar to that of the fractionators. However, the NHF restated its official position in October 1983. On surrogate testing, the fractionators had successfully argued for further consideration through a task force, something that Dr. Ajala has referred to as a delaying tactic. His company, Qatar, had unilaterally begun to test plasma for anti-hepatitis B core antigen, something that he thought would steal a march on his rivals. 1983 also saw the first heat-treated product being licensed. That was Highlands Haemophil T. Armour, Qatar, and Alpha had all applied for licenses during 1983, and as we will see, they were granted early in 1984. Meanwhile, products continued to be recalled. The number of cases of AIDS among people with haemophilia and people having blood transfusions continued to grow. Turning then to the first 6 months of 1984, January saw the publication in the New England Journal of Medicine of a study of 18 AIDS cases where the only risk factor identified was exposure to blood components within 5 years of the onset of the illness. The lead author was Dr. Curran of the CDC. Mr. Justice Creever placed some weight on this publication. He quoted the evidence of Dr. Thomas Zuck of the FDA, who said that the article, and I quote, put the whole medical community and perhaps the world on notice that AIDS is transmitted by blood transfusions. The debate was over. That was Dr. Zuck's view in his evidence to the Creever inquiry. The same month, January 1984, saw Alpha recall factor concentrates as a result of a donor later developing AIDS. So this was the fourth such withdrawal. Highland, May 1983. Highland of the Red Cross in September 1983. Qatar in November 1983. And now Alpha in January 1984. Qatar and Armour products received FDA licenses for heat-treated products in January. Those are the pasteurised form of coate HT and Armour's dry-heated factorate HT. The following month, February 1984, licenses were granted by the FDA to a different heat treatment method from Qatar, that's coate HT dry-heated, and Alpha's propylate HT. We will come back to those products and the heat treatment processes in due course. On the 9th of February 1984, a meeting was held at the UK's National Institute of Biological Standards and Control, NIBSC. It was a meeting that was entitled Meeting on the Infectious Hazards of Blood Products, and it was attended by a number of US and UK fractionators and officials. Among those present on the UK side were Joseph Smith of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, who seems to have taken a convening role at the meeting, Duncan Thomas of the NIBSC, and as we saw yesterday, Dr. Thomas had been present at some of the meetings in the United States that had taken place the previous year. Also present from the UK, Dr. Krask, Dr. Richard Tedder, Dr. Richard Lane, the director of the Blood Products Laboratory, Dr. Terry Snape, his colleague at BPL, Dr. Brian McClelland, and Dr. John Cash of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. US attendees included Dr. Patriciani and representatives of Qatar, Dr. Ashworth, Armour, Dr. Riddell, and Alpha, Dr. Carr. A European representative of Highlands Travenel attended, Mr. J. Van Calster, as did Dr. Eibel of Immuno. I'm going to ask Shumik to bring up the minutes of the meeting that were prepared by Dr. Thomas. They are at PRSE 303071. We've looked at parts of these minutes before. Although they're noted to be draft minutes, we know from other documents, which are set out at paragraph 183 of a written presentation, that Dr. Thomas circulated these minutes, and there were one or two corrections to specific points of detail, but generally they were agreed. I'm not going to take you through all of the document. At paragraph 184 of the written presentation, there is a summary of the issues that were discussed. Dr. Smith opened the meeting by speaking about how the benefits of factor concentrates were assessed against the, what he called, well-recognised side effect of hepatitis and against the emerging knowledge of AIDS. The meeting recorded that 21 people with haemophilia in the US and 11 in Europe, including 2 in the UK, had contracted AIDS. There's 21 in the United States, 11 in Europe, which included the 2 in the United Kingdom.
Did you say to me just earlier that there have been 26 identified?
Yes, that was Dr. Everett's figure.
26 from transfusion and 26 from
26 from, yes.
haemophiliacs.
That's Dr. Everett's figure by the end of August 1983. I'm afraid I can't explain the difference between that figure of 26 and the figure of 21 that was given in the minutes of this meeting. The discussion included an examination of pool sizes that were used in fractionation, and we looked at that during September. The point being made that pool sizes could range anywhere from 1,000 to 20,000 litres of plasma. If we could go to page 3 of the minutes, please. The final paragraph of that section. This is recording a comment made by Dr. Tedder. In considering current views on the etiology of AIDS, Dr. Tedder of the Middlesex Hospital, London, pointed out that AIDS is manifested as a profound deficiency of both cellular and humoral immune systems. One possible explanation is that the occurrence of AIDS in recipients of blood and blood products is due to a filterable agent, presumably a virus. Another possible explanation is an overwhelming of the immune system by repeated infusion of foreign and possibly altered proteins. He suggested that the true explanation may lie between the two extremes, namely that there may be a transmissible agent which only becomes infective when certain conditions are met in the host. Then there's a discussion of possible viruses that may be the cause. Dr. Tedder was presenting a paper which he had prepared for the meeting. If we then move on to the next page, this is dealing with Dr. Patriciani's paper and his presentation to the meeting. If we go down to the paragraph starting Dr. Patriciani, FDA. Dr. Patriciani, FDA, Bethesda, Maryland, outlined the current strategies adopted by the FDA for the identification and exclusion of high-risk donors. 4 strategies have been considered. 1, voluntary limitation by high-risk groups. 2, exclusion of high-risk donors. 3, laboratory testing. I take that to be a reference to surrogate testing. And 4, a combination of the above. Currently, there are no specific laboratory tests that are able to identify a possible AIDS carrier. Although anti-hepatitis B core antibody is positive in more than 90% of AIDS cases, It is also positive in approximately 5% of normal individuals. The approach adopted by the Office of Biologics since March 1983 was for plasma collecting centres to give information to each donor on AIDS, to encourage self-exclusion, and to examine donors for lymphadenopathy. The New York Blood Centre had introduced an additional option, allowing donors to indicate privately that their blood should be used only for research purposes. There is a longer paper that the inquiry has, which is at BAYP 305158. I won't bring it up, sir, but it's the full text of a presentation that Dr. Patriciani made. It describes many of the matters that we went through yesterday, summarising the US debate on them and the position reached as of February 1984. I flag it merely as a helpful resource in understanding what information UK officials have received as of that time from their US counterparts. The minute there is a summary of that paper. If we could now turn to page 5, please. The document, no. Right at the bottom, Dr. Ashworth. Dr. Ashworth, Cutter, described collection procedures at plasmapheresis centres used by the 4 main US companies. Go over to the next page, please. There are some 340 plasmapheresis stations in 42 states, employing 6,000 people. Approximately a third of these centres are owned by the companies, and the rest supply plasma under contract. All plasmapheresis stations in the United States are licensed by the FDA, as is the centre in Belize. Dr. Ashworth described the donor records in detail, including questions intended to identify and exclude AIDS carriers. A detailed system exists which allows easy identification of product batches that contain material from a particular donor. Some companies are now avoiding taking plasma from centres in high-risk areas of the United States, although he pointed out that not all donors who contracted AIDS lived in these areas. For example, both Cutter and Alpha Therapeutics have each had one donor who was later shown to have developed AIDS. In both cases, the donors were from Texas, which is considered a low-risk area.
Just a point of detail on that account. You showed me earlier the memo when Highland decided to stop taking plasma from prisons. It showed that that Highland had a contract with the donor centre at the prison.
Yes.
And the contract would persist, and therefore they'd have to pay, even though they were not going to use the plasma which they then received until the contract expired. It would follow that the centre, or some of the centres concerned at any rate, were not directly owned by Highland.
Yes.
And it would also follow that they were going on operating. But it was the FDA that was asking Highland to stop taking plasma from prisons. And yet, they were, if this is right, it looks as though, in the absence of further information, there were plasmapheresis stations in the United States operating in prisons, collecting plasma, which remained licensed by the FDA despite the knowledge or belief that those in prison would disproportionately be affected by hepatitis and by AIDS.
Yes. The FDA's conversation with Highland was about the use of prison plasma specifically in factor concentrates. It is possible that plasma from prisons might have been used in other blood products which were thought or known not to pass on infectious diseases. So that may be an economic reason why those centres could continue. But certainly the FDA would have been aware of those centres and would have been regulating them.
Yes. Yes.
Going back to the document, the following paragraph, just before we do move to the next paragraph, I just flag up the reference there to a donor from Texas that had led to recalls, or donors from Texas that had led to recalls of product by Cutter and Alpha. You will recall that yesterday, sir, I showed you a document from February 1983 from the Alpha company and the committee of Alpha, which discussed a Dallas donor who had, and I quote, some AIDS symptoms. That was February 1983. We know that the Alpha withdrawal of product was in January 1984, and in the following month, February 1984, there is reference to a donor from Texas being responsible for that recall. What we don't know is whether or not that Texas donor is the same as the Dallas donor who was being discussed a year earlier. Going on to the next paragraph. In discussion, Dr. Cash commented that paid donors are perhaps less likely to be truthful about their activities than volunteer donors. Dr. Riddell disputed this and pointed out that in 3 of the 4 instances of blood donors contracting AIDS, leading to a subsequent withdrawal of product, the donors were in fact non-paid volunteers. Furthermore, the payment to plasmapheresis donors probably sufficed only to cover their expenses. If we... Yes, I think we can go to pages 9 and 10 now of the document. There was a discussion from Dr. Lane and Dr. Snape about fractionation. There were also discussions about hepatitis B testing. But I'd like to turn now to the bottom of page 9 and the section of the minutes that deal with an open discussion that took place after the formal presentations had occurred. It says that the discussion focused on 4 main issues. I quote, 1, what should be done about blood products made from plasma pools when one of the donors to that pool subsequently developed AIDS? This has already happened to US manufacturers, leading to withdrawal of the affected batches. Dr. Thomas asked Dr. Patriciani whether the FDA had specifically requested the manufacturer to withdraw batches that had been made from an affected pool. Dr. Patriciani replied that no formal instruction had been issued by the FDA, but the withdrawal had taken place as a result of informal discussion and agreement. The general feeling of the meeting was that if the diagnosis of AIDS in a donor is definite, then products prepared from pools to which the donor had contributed should be withdrawn. If a donor is found to have symptoms and signs, such as lymphadenopathy, which were associated with incipient AIDS, but were neither diagnostic nor specific for the condition, the recall of material to which the subject had previously contributed plasma was not justified. It was recognized that the scientific rationale for this course of action left much to be desired, but that no other action could be taken which would not imperil the supply of Factor VIII. As far as laboratory tests for screening for AIDS are concerned, it was generally agreed that, on present evidence, only the test for hepatitis B core antibody was thought likely to be of value. However, there was no general agreement that such testing for core antibody should be part of a routine screening carried out on all donors. There was much discussion about the optimal size of plasma pools, but no agreement that reduction of pool size would be either a practicable or a successful way to reduce the transmission of either hepatitis or AIDS. I will leave that document there, sir, and instead turn to the other source that we have for what was said at that meeting, which was a memorandum prepared by Dr. Carr of Alpha. And that gives a slightly different perspective on some of the passages that we have just read. If we could have on screen, please, CGRA 40610. This is dealing with the same section, page 6. You can see from that first page that it's an internal Cutter memorandum. Internal Alpha memorandum. We're looking now at Dr. Carr's summary of the general discussion and suggested recommendations. This is the same part of the meeting that we've just been looking at. What Dr. Carr wrote is this: identification and exclusion of high-risk donors. Dr. Smith, that's Dr. Joseph Smith, stated that he was very reassured by the clear policies in the US and the UK. He expressed concern over what is done when the donor is identified as an AIDS donor and additionally as a suspect AIDS donor. Dr. Patriciani stated that we were still struggling with the question as to what should be done. The 4 US market withdrawals were discussed, and we explained that we were all still making decisions on a case-by-case basis. The decisions were not being made based on scientific information, but simply because of emotional and political considerations. During this discussion, it was very emphatically noted that 3 out of the 4 market withdrawals involved volunteer donors, not paid donors. B. Fractionation and processing methods. There were some concerns expressed over the safety of heat-treated products. Dr. Bloom, as a consultant to NIBSC, stated that he was not sure that there was enough data on the potential immunogenicity of the heat-treated products. A brief explanation of the types of animal immunogenicity data collected was described. There followed a very lengthy discussion on the value of small pool size versus the use of large pools. We were finally able to show them that even with a small pool size, because of the fact that they are collecting individual donations, the exposure of the haemophiliac to numerous donors would still be there. Dr. Smith summed up this discussion by stating that they should encourage the development of fractionation and processing controls for lowered infectivity, i.e. physical and chemical inactivation. Go to the next page, please. Dr. Smith asked Dr. Bloom whether or not dosage guidelines should be developed. Dr. Bloom stated he did not see how they could develop them when they do not have enough NTS, I think that should probably be NHS, material. And haemophiliacs must either go untreated or they must use foreign material. Dr. Patriciani noted that AHF was not considered overused in the United States, and this was not an issue. Rather, there was some concern that it was being underused. Laboratory test procedures. Dr. Smith summed up this item with practically no discussion at all, stating for the attendees that no laboratory test procedures can be recommended at this time. If we go to the bottom, the last couple of sentences, there's a discussion about the safety of hepatitis B immune globulin, and then this. Finally, it seemed apparent to me that the British will watch very closely what is done in the US, and in this case seem to be tending to follow our lead. In talking privately with Dr. Thomas before the meeting, he told me that he wasn't sure that we should have withdrawn our product, but postulated probably our lawyers would advise us that we had to. From his point of view, he did not think we should have. That's Dr. Carr's record of the final stages of that meeting in February 1984. Moving back to the United States, the task force, or sometimes referred to as a study group, on anti-hepatitis B core testing that had been established in the December 1983 meeting. That's the body that was seen by Dr. Rajala as a delaying tactic. It met on the 6th of March 1984. Dr. Riddell was in the chair. A full report from the committee of the task force wasn't presented until July 1984, but following the 6th of March meeting, the group provided an interim report and recommendations. If we could have a look at those, please. They are at MHRA 5076_010. You can see this is entitled Interim Summary Statement of Hepatitis B Core Antibody Testing Study Group by Michael B. Riddell, the chairman. What the interim statement says is this. On March 6, 1984, the study group, formed subsequent to the December 1983 meeting of the FDA Blood Products Advisory Committee, met to discuss the issue of testing potential blood and or plasma donors for core antibody to hepatitis B, anti-HBC. Membership of the study group consisted of representatives of the commercial and non-commercial fractionation industry, the plasmapheresis community, non-profit blood collection and processing organisations, and the Food and Drug Administration. The purpose of the meeting was to review all aspects and ramifications of the use of testing for anti-HBC as an additional means of determining whether potential donors were members of high-risk groups associated with acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Although a full report of the study group's deliberations and conclusions will be furnished to the Food and Drug Administration in the near future, it was felt that an interim statement should be made available at this time. The study group was divided in its position on testing for anti-HBC as a means of identifying AIDS high-risk group members, with the majority believing that such testing was not appropriate for that purpose. However, members of a majority group indicated that they would likely be compelled to follow suit if any of the organisations represented initiated anti-HBC testing programmes. The report to be prepared will contain position papers summarising the majority and minority opinions on this issue. It was clearly recognised by the study group that a positive finding of anti-HBC in an individual was not necessarily indicative of AIDS or the future development of a disease state. Rather, it was viewed as a possible mechanism of identifying high-risk group members, a number of whom are positive for this serological marker. It was the prevailing opinion of the study group that if testing programs for anti-HBC are employed, they should not be confined to the plasma donor population, but should extend to whole blood donors as well. There was unanimity on two additional issues that the study group addressed. First, the study group recommended the initiation of a pilot study in at least 2 metropolitan areas to ascertain the effectiveness of allowing plasma donors to privately provide a written indication as to whether their plasma should be used in the manufacture of products used in haemophilia treatment, analogous to the system currently utilised by the New York Blood Centre in whole blood collections. Secondly, the study group recommended that pilot studies involving testing for beta-2 microglobulin levels be designed, since the presence of this analyte appears to offer a higher degree of correlation with prodromal or active AIDS. Thank you. That can be taken down. That is the formal record as prepared by Dr. Riddell, the chair of the group. We also have an account of a meeting from an internal Cutter memorandum prepared by Dr. Hink, and that is at CGRA 40319, please. This is dated the 13th of March 1984 and refers back to that meeting held on the 6th of March. The first thing to note for the people who are on that working group is Marietta Carr from Alpha, whose memorandum we just looked at, Dr. Donahue from the FDA, Dr. Marilyn Horowitz from the New York Blood Center, Dr. Peter Page of the American Red Cross, Dr. Robert Geraghty, again of the Bureau of Biologics of the FDA, we mentioned him yesterday, Dr. Hink himself from Cutter, Dr. Joanna Pindick of the New York Blood Center, Dr. Bob Riley of the Association American Blood Resources Association, Dr. Toby Simon of the American Association of Blood Banks, so blood banking industry body, Dr. Rick Strigley of Highland, Dr. Mike Riddell of ARMA, who was the chair. If we begin with this summary, paragraph 1, what Dr. Hink wrote is this. On the question of beginning hepatitis B core antibody, anti-HBC, testing of source plasma donors, following 5 hours of discussion, a vote was taken. Donahue, Strigley, and Hink voted in favour. All others, with the exception of Geraghty, who I believe abstained, were not in favour. Pause there to note so that Dr. Donahue of the FDA is therefore in favour of the testing, as are the representatives of Highland, Dr. Strigley, and Cutter, Dr. Hink. Dr. Geraghty is believed to have abstained. Everybody else, including the representatives of Alpha and of ARMA, voted against. The summary goes on to mention the position papers that will be prepared and the pilot studies and investigations that the working group had recommended. And if we go to point 5, please. Immediately prior to the conclusion of our meeting, it was recommended that the industry should refrain from starting anti-HBC testing. Carr was adamant that Alpha would not begin. Rodell said ARMA would not use the test unless a competitor was using it to competitive advantage. Strigley indicated he could not speak for his company management, and I parroted his comment. Pause there to note so that we know from memoranda that by this stage Cutter had already commenced some form of anti-HBC testing. If we go over to the next page, please, page 2 electronically, we can pick up some of the contributions that were made to the test, to the debate. It began with Dr. Donahue setting out his concerns. I won't go through that. We could pick up from Dr. Hink, and I quote, additional screening is necessary to reduce the risk of coagulation product withdrawal/recall. Recalls are not only costly, but could create a shortage of material available to haemophiliacs. Anti-HBC testing can be carried out in high volume by the industry and by volunteer segments, if desirable. CDC reports that over 75% of the high-risk AIDS groups are positive, and as a marker for hepatitis, it is reported that exclusion of positive units has reduced the incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis from blood transfusion. If the test is implemented for SB(H), it should be agreed that coagulation products manufactured from core antibody-negative plasma would not be subject to AIDS-related recall. Dr. Strigley said, and I quote, Strigley agrees that additional plasma screening is necessary and anti-HBC is a likely candidate. When questioned about current AIDS investigations at Highland, he thought, but could not be certain, that of 7 cases, only 3 or 4 were anti-HBC positive. Dr. Pindick is quoted or cited next. She was from the New York Blood Center. And I quote, I won't go through everything which she said, but I quote, anti-HBC has low selectivity, not worthwhile for volunteer segment. I take that to mean a reference to voluntary blood donor blood banks. Suggests there may be better tests being developed. So that was her view. Geraghty, this is Robert Geraghty of the FDA's hepatitis branch. And you may recall, sir, that we looked yesterday at the scepticism that Dr. Geraghty had expressed about anti-hepatitis B testing in the January 1983 meeting. But rather like Dr. Donoghue, we see that he had by this time softened.
I think we may need to move on to the next screen.
Yes, sorry, it's electronic page 3. So Geraghty there. If we pick up from the top of that, AIDS cases remain with high-risk groups. Concerned about anti-HBS level in plasma pools if anti-HBC positives excluded. So that's the concern that we have discussed previously, that the inadvertent effect of this might be to reduce the protection against hepatitis B. However, only small amount necessary to provide antigen complex safety. Feels elimination of anti-HBC positives would improve HBV, hepatitis B virus, non-A, non-B hepatitis virus, and AIDS safety of coagulation products. He questions mechanics validity of test with 50% cutoff, suggests a 75% cutoff. It would reduce the 15% positive rate now experienced. I pause there to note that this seems to be a suggestion that instead of excluding any donation which tested positive, a certain level would be imposed, and if it was above that level, then that would be plasma would be excluded, which would reduce the amount of plasma that would have to be discarded. That's the 15% positive rate. But there is then a discussion that goes on about whether or not that is a good idea. Looking at some of the other contributions.
Just go on, I think.
It will reduce the 15% positive rate now experienced. This is still Dr. Geraghty. Yes, sorry. High percentage, up to 90% of haemophiliacs now dying of liver disease. If anti-HBC testing implemented, antibody positive plasma should be used in manufacture of gamma globulins. Presumably, that was on the basis that those products wouldn't pass on infectious diseases and it would avoid the waste of plasma that would otherwise take place. I note there, sir, that Dr. Geraghty was thought by Dr. Hink to have abstained during the subsequent vote, but certainly a softening of his position when compared to where he was in January 1983. The next contribution is from Dr. Peter Page of the American Red Cross. And I quote, "Don't think we should start with low specificity anti-HBC tests now. If begun, we could be stuck with it, even if better tests developed." Dr. Geraghty appears to have intervened at this point. The record says, Geraghty sees no reason anti-HBC should be continued if better tests implemented at later date. Dr. Carr of Alpha, I quote, "Sees problem with volunteer plasma if anti-HBC test conducted with SPH only. Suggests plasma shortage if test implemented." Then says that Alpha is currently conducting 8,000 hepatitis B surface antigen tests per day. The next contribution is from Toby Simon of the American Association of Blood Banks, and I quote, "Whatever test is imposed on industry would be required for volunteer segment. Earlier pilot study with anti-HBC identified only 38% of known gays as positive. Everett of CDC told him only 50% of key blood donors suspected of transmitting AIDS were found anti-HBC positive." So Dr. Simon casting some doubt on figures that have been elsewhere cited of 90%. Riddell, the final contribution.
This may go back to link with what you showed me yesterday as the expanded table which Everett produced, where he showed the greater prevalence of anti-HBC, of hepatitis B core antigen in certain risk groups, and showed the high-risk groups were significantly higher in their prevalence rates than was the so-called normal donor.
Yes.
And it must follow, it doesn't necessarily follow that the percentage of positivity in donors is echoed by the exact same percentage in those who suffer from the disease. It's the point I raised with you yesterday.
Yes, but the figures that Dr. Simon cites there are not consistent with Dr. Everett's figures from that table.
What did he say in the table for those who were?
If we could bring up, please, can we do a split screen, please, Shumik, and have CVHB 5042, page 5. We put that on one side, and then the document that we've just been looking at on the other. Sorry, I'm throwing this one at you at the last minute. CVHB 5042. Then it's electronic page 5 of that document.
We can come back to it later. At the moment, we're just getting the each page in turn.
But perhaps
we can see enough, I think, from that if we just enlarge the table at the bottom.
I have the figures from Dr. Simon in front of me, so I can remind you of those in a second, sir.
Thank you. So let's just enlarge the table at the bottom and see what he was saying.
This is from 1982, and the first cohort of population is labelled AIDS cases, so presumably people who have been identified as having AIDS. It's the left-hand column that we're interested in, anti-HBC percentage positive.
Yes.
88% of people who had AIDS and who were homosexual or bisexual. 100% of people who had AIDS and were drug users intravenously. 86% of people who had AIDS and were Haitians. The others group, we don't know what that is, specifies. One can perhaps surmise that this is probably people who've developed AIDS through person-to-person contact or possibly through blood transfusion or the use of blood products. That other group is 42.9%.
I mean, the issue is knowing for those who made donations, as opposed to those who actually were AIDS cases. So the group, the risk group, the Haitians are 36%, so they're 7 times more likely to have hepatitis B than hepatitis, or to be anti-HBC positive, than our normal controls. Homosexuals are 80% roughly.
Yes.
4 out of every 5 are likely to be. It doesn't take an overall figure across the risk groups, does it?
No, it doesn't. But the figure that is given by Dr. Simon was that Everett of CDC told him only 50% of key blood donors suspected of transmitting AIDS.
Yes, it's a very difficult description to mine to understand precisely what's being said.
Yes, and also the other point to make about it is that Dr. Simon was saying that in March 1984. This table comes from 1982.
And the person who is saying it has a particular vested interest in not wanting to do the test.
Yes, and voted against it.
Yes.
We do have some later figures that I will come to about anti-hepatitis B core testing, but that is, I think, as far as we can take it from that document. But
it shows that my initial suggestion that it refers back to that table. It doesn't necessarily.
No. Dr. Simon also refers to a pilot study. We don't know which pilot study that was, but that was said to have identified only 38% of known gays as positive. What is meant by known gays is not explained in this document. Just to finish off the meeting from the 13th of March, Dr. Riddell, and I quote, Riddell questions if anti-HBC test is sufficiently specific to be effective. It would exclude only 50% of donors with AIDS prodrome. Provided figures showing anti-HBC testing and rejection of positive donors should cost several $1 million per year. So that's Dr. Riddell provided those figures. 14 to 15 Plasma Alliance centres collecting about 850,000 litres per year. ARMA currently derive all plasma from Plasma Alliance, no contract centres. What isn't clear from that note is whether the cost of several $1 million per year is intended to refer just to ARMA's costs or to the costs across the industry. But what is perhaps notable is that the figures of $100 million and $150 million per year, which we saw yesterday, aren't repeated at this meeting, at least according to the records that we have of it. Finally, on that meeting, Dr. Riddell provided a copy of his summary report to Dr. Thomas of NIBSC on the 9th of February. That was following up, as it were. Sorry, not on the 9th of February. He provided it in March 1984, following up on the meeting that had taken place on the 9th of February. I'm about to move on to a related but distinct topic of Cutter's approach to hepatitis B core testing, and I know the time, sir.
Well, shall we have our morning break then until 5 to 12? 5 to 12.